Is this really YouTube if I don't have a candle in the background? Hey y'all, welcome back to the first 47 books challenge video analysis thing, LitCritKnit of 2018, of the reboot. So the book for today is Emma by Jane Austen. So let's get into it. So to start with a little bit of background about Jane Austen. She was the 7th out of 8 kids born in December of 1775. Wrote 6 total finished novels plus 1 unfinished. And they were in 2 spurts. First spurt was, according to my notes, was 1796 to 1798, so she was only in her early 20s, like my age. And that was Northanger Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, and Sense and Sensibility. And then the next spurt was after her father's death in 1809, and those are Emma, Persuasion, and Mansfield Park. The first spurt wasn't necessarily published then. Northanger Abbey wasn't even published until about 1818, posthumously, because she died in the summer of 1817. So that's Jane Austen, but let's get into the summary. So Emma Woodhouse is 20-ish and single, and would like to stay that way. She's also fairly rich and thinks she knows everything, especially about people. She takes credit for setting up her governess in marriage with one Mr. Weston. And at the wedding, she decides that she wants to do it again for the vicar, Mr. Elton, which doesn't go as planned. Emma chooses Harriet Smith, who's about 17. She's a little naive and respects Emma a little too much. And she's got kind of a mysterious background, which means Emma thinks that she's destined for greatness, but maybe not. Harriet's interested in a local farmer, Mr. Robert Martin, but of course, since Emma thinks that Harriet's destined for greatness, Emma doesn't approve of Mr. Martin, and it's a whole thing. But she tries to set up Harriet and Mr. Elton, which doesn't really go too well. Mr. Elton, why don't you hang out with me and Harriet? Why, sure. Isn't this drawing I did of Harriet just so good? You did so good. Mr. Martin proposed. What do I do? Turn him down, duh. What? So George Knightley is Emma's brother-in-law, lifelong friend. And because of that, he's pretty much the only person who can or gets to call Emma on her bullshit. That includes things like, maybe Robert Martin was a good match for Harriet, and you know, I think Mr. Elton is into Emma. Mr. Knightley turns out to be right on the Elton front and on the Martin front, but we'll get to that later. Mr. Elton proposes to Emma on a carriage ride on the way home from this holiday party. Will you marry me? Ew, no. What about Harriet? Ew, no. What? Told you. Possibly the most awkward carriage ride ever, and that concludes Act 1. In Act 2, you learn that Mr. Elton got married to someone else that absolutely no one can stand, especially and including Emma, because she's all pretentious and all of these negative qualities that Emma can sometimes display in herself, but is respected enough in the community to let it slide. And you also meet Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. Frank is Mr. Weston's son, but he grew up with his aunt and took the aunt's name. And Jane is basically all of Emma's talents and a little bit extra, but none of Emma's money or social standing. Like, she's really good at piano, but she doesn't have one when she's staying with her aunt, Miss Bates. And what should arrive but a surprise piano? So Harriet eventually gets over her feelings for Mr. Elton and decides that she thinks she's into someone else.
And Emma thinks Harriet's into Frank, but Frank and Jane are secretly engaged. Frank is responsible for the piano, but Emma and Frank have been flirting, and Emma thought she kind of had feelings for Frank, but not really. But then it turns out that Emma kind of had feelings for Nightwing, Nightwing kind of had feelings for her, but Harriet actually had feelings for Nightwing, not Frank. And so everyone gets married, and Harriet gets married to Robert Martin at the end.
Congrats! Okay, so time for a little bit of analytical stuff. Firstly, why is this on the list in the first place? What got it on the list, I think? I mean, aside from it being on 3 out of 5 lists of books that you should read in your lifetime, I think it made the list because it's considered one of the first modern novels. It's also potentially considered Austen's best novel. It's one of the last ones she wrote before she died. It was only published in about 1815, 1816. And again, she died in 1817, so it's literally like one of the last. It presents this interesting narrative choice called free and direct discourse, where it's basically third person limited with some extra narration. Like, you mostly get into Emma's head, you don't get into anyone else's head, which you didn't really see before that. It was either first person or third person omniscient, so getting into everyone's head. And when it was third person limited, it was only in that person's head. But with Emma, it's an interesting blend of third person limited and then a little bit of extra hearing about like maybe why this isn't the usual thing, or why you hear a lot of Emma's internal monologue without saying, I did this, I did that, blah, blah, blah. Frank Churchill's hot. Whatever. You don't necessarily hear that. There's some interesting themes as well. Biggest one is love and marriage and class distinction. Emma thinks Harriet's background is a little mysterious. And so Emma thinks that that means that her father was someone rich and famous, even though that's not the case. And so that's why initially Emma wants her to set up with Mr. Elton, because, well, if Harriet's father was rich, then why wouldn't she be on the same level as Mr. Elton? But Mr. Elton also thinks he can sort of move up to Emma's level, but Emma thinks he has quite a bit of nerve for proposing because she sees herself as so far above him. But then when it turns out that Harriet's father was only a moderately successful businessman, it was sort of, well, Mr. Martin seems a pretty good match for you then. So there's an interesting set of class distinctions for the marriage part of it. I came across this article online from the New York Times. I'll leave the link below if I can find it again. But it's a book review on is Jane Austen the first game theorist? And game theory is a mathematical and political thing. The person who first initially wrote about it was in 1944. World War II was about to end. Cold War, it was sort of brought up and popularized in the Cold War, trying to sort of politically anticipate what would be coming. It's so obvious and so sort of, author calls it game theory, what Jane Austen is doing with Emma. I called it plotting a novel. You have to sort of play God in that sense. So theoretically, yes, theoretically it is game theory, because as the author you have to figure out, okay, this person's going to do this and elicit this reaction. Yeah, game theory seems a little too neat of a package for it, but it's definitely an interesting concept and an interesting thesis. So the mathematicians and politicians and sciencey people, let me know what you think, because with Emma, I can sort of see where he might have gotten it, but how much of that is game theory? So anyway, just some interesting topics to think about. Would I recommend this? Sort of. It takes a few readings to really get behind Emma, because she's kind of a difficult character to like, especially the first time around. And Jane Austen said herself that Emma was kind of a character that only she would really like. If this is your first introduction to Jane Austen's work, I would say go for Pride and Prejudice or Northanger Abbey, because I've never read any of the other ones. I'll admit that up front. I've only read those three. Yeah, Pride and Prejudice or Northanger Abbey are kind of, they're both socially critiquing, but Northanger Abbey is parody gothic, which is kind of fun. Do I think it's worth it to read Emma? Sure. I mean, if you're gonna read any Austen, Emma's a good choice. But let me know what you think. Did you like Emma? Do you think no one ever should read Emma or Northanger or Pride and Prejudice, but should instead read Persuasion or Sense and Sensibility or Mansfield Park? Have you read Sanditon? Because that's apparently like the unfinished 7th novel. Let me know in the comments below. Other adaptations. The ones I know of, there's probably more, but the ones I know of are Emma Approved, which the same company that did Lizzie Bennet Diaries. It's a YouTube series that I'll leave linked below. There's a 2009 BBC miniseries about it. There was, and probably most famously, and also the loosest adaptation is the film Clueless from the 1990s, which I've only seen part of. But yeah, I will leave what links I can find down below. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you in the next one. Coming up next, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.